Chris Ferris Show. Welcome back to the Chris Ferris Show. So glad to have you guys with us again. We're moving now into part 2 of moving beyond resentments. And I hope that the last episode helped you to take some time to identify where are these resentments coming from, what are they rooted in, what is the cause, and to see how they are, once they're fully matured and fully developed, how they play out in our lives, how they affect not just us, but the people around us and the ones that we love. Today we're going to talk about how do we actually move beyond them. Is it possible to live life on the other side of these resentments? For some of us, we can't even imagine. Some of the wounds and the emotional trauma, the things that we've experienced is so profound that we can't even in our heads imagine letting all of that go or living life no longer being affected by it. But I'm going to tell you this, guys, and this isn't me. I mean, through the power of God, through the power of Jesus Christ, you have the ability, you have the power and the authority to rise above and to transcend these things in your life. It's not just a mental game. Remember this. God will do for you what you cannot do for yourself when you're doing for yourself what you can. So what are some of the intentional things that we can do and the steps that we can take to rise above, to move beyond this resentment that we carry in our lives? Well, let me give you a couple things. I just got some notes here that I want to give you that I think will help you to journal this out and to write this down. First thing I want to tell you is this, is that the deepest emotional wounds that you will have in your life are going to come from those with whom you have the deepest relationships. Somebody once said the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from the enemy. And this is true. It doesn't. The deepest wounds that you're going to carry in your life will come from those with whom you have the deepest relationships. Number 2, remember this, we said it in the last episode, that hurt people hurt people. So the reason that somebody hurt you, violated your trust, violated the boundary, didn't meet the expectation, whatever the story may be in your context, the reason that they did that was because they got hurt and didn't ever heal from the hurt. I mean, that's just how the story goes. Number 3, I want you to remember this, is that relationship wounds, these type of wounds, they put us in a place to start living defensive lives. We live defensively if we do not heal from these wounds. And then the last thing I want you guys to write down, I want you to know, is that these relationship wounds, this trauma, again, we said it last week, we're going to say it again, it will not heal itself. It doesn't just go away. It actually has a lasting and profound effect on you. So I want to read a passage of scripture to you from Matthew chapter 18. I think it's one of the most powerful stories in the Bible where Jesus was asked about forgiveness. And he had one of his disciples by the name of Peter, one of the apostles, who came to him and began a narrative about how many times should he forgive the ones that hurt him. Jesus said something in this narrative that I believe is the game changer. In fact, I will tell you, I've heard this taught wrong. I probably taught it wrong. I'm sure that I've taught it wrong myself in the past. But I did some research around this, and I want to point something out. I actually want to encourage you. It's Matthew chapter 18, 21 through 35 is the entire narrative. We don't have time in 15 minutes to read all of it. I'm going to read just a couple of verses, but I want to encourage you to go read this because there's a parable and an analogy that Jesus gives in this narrative in Matthew chapter 18 that really sort of unpacks what we're about to talk about and what he meant in this conversation that he was having with Peter. So let me read this to you. Matthew chapter 18. I'm going to read verses 21 and 22. And here's what the passage says. Then Peter came up to him, to Jesus, and said, Lord, how often will my brother sin against me and I forgive him? As many as 7 times? Now let me just stop for a minute because this is really cool. Peter felt pretty spiritual in this moment because in Jewish tradition in those days, the consideration for somebody who was spiritual was to forgive 3 times. If you're really spiritual, 5 times. It was like a 3 to 5 time forgiveness process, right? Peter comes in feeling ultra spiritual and he says, how many times should I forgive the one who wrongs me? 7 times? Like, I'm going to take it to the next level. I'm going to go to 7. Can you imagine how deflated he must have felt in Jesus' next words? This is really powerful. Look what Jesus said. Jesus said to him, I do not say 7 times, but 77 times. Now, this is important. Jesus wasn't saying you forgive someone 77 times and then on the 78th time it stops. This was an actual number of continuation. It just keeps going. So I want to say it this way. Ultimately, what Jesus was saying to Peter is that you forgive the person who wronged you as many times as necessary. As many times as what is necessary? Well, I think we need to understand and unpack the word forgive here before we answer that question. There's a couple things you need to understand what Jesus was not saying when he was telling Peter to forgive those who wronged him. The first thing Jesus was not saying was that by forgiving them, you're absolving their sin. We don't have the power to absolve sin. Only God has the power to absolve sin. So he wasn't saying, hey, you're going to forgive them and absolve them of their wrong. That's between them and God. So that's not what Jesus was saying. The other thing that Jesus was saying is this forgiveness does not mean that what that person did to you was okay. What they did was right. It probably wasn't. In fact, if you were wrong, what they did to you was probably wrong. And the reason that I want to draw attention to this is because I want those of us who have felt significant pain, we've experienced significant and profound trauma, I want us to understand that Jesus isn't saying if you forgive them, you're giving them a free pass, that you're saying what they did was okay. It's not okay, and that's not what Jesus was saying. The other thing that Jesus was not saying in this is that you have to be in a relationship with that person again. By forgiving them, it means that you're going to be in a relationship with them again. I will tell you that a lot of people hold on to this resentment. They hold on to this anger, and they let this stew inside them. They marinate on it for years and years because they don't want to let that person off the hook, and they certainly don't want that person to assume that they're going to be back in a relationship with them. Here's the deal. Some of those people are still very sick and very broken. They've never done anything to find health and wholeness for themselves, which means what? You're not supposed to have them back in your life. That's not God's best for you. So what was he saying? What was Jesus saying when he said forgive? Well, when you look this word up in the Greek and the Aramaic, it's an interesting word. The word literally means to separate from, to walk away, to separate or walk away. It's actually the exact same phraseology or terminology that they used for separation or divorce in marriage. To separate, to put away, or to walk away. So what Jesus was saying and what he was describing forgiveness to be was not about the one that you were forgiving, but the one who was offering the forgiveness. He was saying this, that when you're forgiving that person, you're doing two things. You're no longer holding them accountable to what they did to you, and you're no longer holding them or yourself accountable to the pain that came from what they did to you. Now let process through that. Let that really sink in and grab a hold of the reality behind that truth. This forgiveness is not about the one you're forgiving. It's about the one, you, who's offering the forgiveness. He's saying, I'm calling you into a life where you can separate yourself from the action of what was done and holding that person accountable to the pain that came from that action, including letting yourself go, not holding yourself accountable to that pain. See, this is what victims do. Remember what we said in the first part of this episode. We said that being a victim is not a choice, but staying one is. Here's what victims do. They are, especially those who have experienced profound hurt. You've experienced profound hurt and pain and just deep violation to your life and physically, sexually, whatever the story may be. What happens and what victims tend to do is they say, I'm going to, for the rest of your life, I'm going to hold you accountable to this action, but not just to the action. I'm going to hold you accountable to the pain that came out of it or came from that action. You are going to feel what I'm feeling. You're going to be held accountable to that pain for the rest of it, and I'm not letting you off the hook. Remember what we said in the first part of this episode, of episode 1 of this? It's like this is the part that's like drinking poison and expecting somebody else to die. It's not affecting them. I can tell you this right now. If they haven't gotten better, you know what they're doing? They've moved on to another victim. They're onto someone else that they can hurt, that they can violate, that they can step all over, walk all over, cheat on, whatever. They've moved on to the next. You're not even a part of their story anymore. Yet you're holding on to it, and it's eating you alive, and it's destroying you. So what Jesus was offering was something that you can't really do on your own. This is one of those things that comes through the power, through surrendering and submitting to what he's called you to do. So here's the step. Here's what it takes. You're saying, okay, I'm going to trust the fact. I'm going to trust what you're saying here, Jesus, that I have the power, that I can remove myself or separate myself. I can relinquish that person and no longer hold that person accountable to what they did. And I can step into the power of no longer holding them accountable to that pain and no longer me being accountable to that pain. I can literally separate myself from doing that. Now, I want to just make this very, very clear. This is not a one and done. And this is why Jesus said 77 times. In other words, however many times you need to carry this out with that one event or that one person, do it over and over and over again until God brings you to the other side of it, till you get to that place where you're no longer living in the resentment. You get to that place where you're no longer holding people accountable to the pain of that action, that thing that happened to you, and you're transcending. You're moving beyond that resentment and that anger. And here's what happens. This is the supernatural thing that happens. When we move past the resentment, when we let it go, when we separate from it, when we let the people go who hurt us and we no longer hold them accountable to the pain, what begins to supernaturally happen is the fear that we live in, that defense mechanism, that begins to transition. We begin to move out of the defense and back into the offense. Remember, the Bible says God did not give you a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. And so the fear begins to dissipate. We begin to dismantle that fear. And here is where it gets great, guys. As that fear dismantles, guess what begins to change? The behavior. The behaviors begin to change. You're no longer operating from a place of defense. You're no longer operating in that spirit of fear. So the behaviors begin to change. And you know this, if the behaviors change, so do the patterns. And so what I want to challenge you to do today is to really evaluate this in your life. Who is it that has brought significant pain to you? Go to Matthew chapter 18, read verses 21 through 35. By the way, read the rest of that story. You'll see exactly what this means in that narrative, the allegory that Jesus gives in what this looks like in real time. You'll see it. It'll make sense to you. But the challenge is you have to be willing to walk it out, become intentional to walk this out. And I promise you, God will do for you what you cannot do for yourself, so long as you're doing for yourself what you can. God bless you.